Okay, so we want to move from abstract to concrete. Criteria for success, outcomes, relatable topics, expectations, great. Okay, these are all very important. So what do I want? What do I want to teach? How am I going ahead, how am I going to go ahead and teach it? As well as how will I measure for success? And then you've got a number of other strategies, attention grabbers, exit tickets, okay, checking for understanding. Awesome. Okay. Now, I don't want to say that this was a trick question because it wasn't, but with the background that we had leading up to this point in the presentation so far, what is the one part of the lesson plan that, as far as I can tell, nobody referenced that you think that I would want you to start including moving forward? Okay, all this is great, by the way. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you so much. Okay, yeah, prior knowledge, questioning, these are all good, all good. Keep them coming. Think about our topic. Tying in previous knowledge is good, but it speaks to a bigger issue. It speaks to a bigger, you're all right, but it speaks to a bigger issue. What is that bigger issue? Okay. By the way, anyone who's replying in the Q&A piece, it's harder for me to see that. So please make sure your comments go into the chat and that your chat is set to all panelists and attendees. I'll tell you what I was looking for. Angela got it. Okay, let's see if anybody else here has it. Carol, yes. The idea of, and by the way, there's nothing wrong with the rest of your answers. They're awesome. But specifically what I was looking for is how do we teach for retention? That's really the question I want us to be asking all the time. What could I be doing on a regular basis that's going to ensure that whatever I teach is going to be remembered well from the outset, right? Remember, you remember things better if you're clearer from the beginning. So getting it clear is really important. Thinking about modalities and the way that we remember things is also important. And also thinking about how we're going to sort of loop back and ensure that the learning is reinforced over time. All of those hands-on activities matter. Yeah, this is good stuff. Okay, you guys are really all in and I appreciate it. All right, so let's go a little bit further here. So a few more questions. Again, in a think, pair, share environment, we'd be able to be talking to each other. But here's some questions I'd like to unpack with you. Number one, when we talk about memory, what is it? Right? Is it synonymous with retention, which is question number two? Or would you argue that they're different? Question number three are, what are the implications of memory on education? Right, when we think about education, where does memory fit in the big picture here? How much of a factor is it in the quality of instruction? Now, we have talked about before, for those of you who are new, I'm sharing this with you. For those of you who are returnees, I apologize if it sounds a bit redundant, but it's good review. And minimally, I think it's helpful for everybody, right? It's not good enough to say that I taught something, right? The goal here is to make sure that learning occurs. So we're no longer teachers. We are facilitators of learning. That is our role. That's our responsibility. Our job is to ensure that learning occurs. Bottom line, I don't care how you do it. All right, I don't care if you figure out some way to take a cable and kind of like port it from your mouth into their brain. If you can come up with that technology, that's fine. Okay, not really, but you get the idea. The main thing is we want to ensure that learning is occurring. We also want to make sure that information is remembered, because it's not valuable if our students are learning something in September, for example, and by the time we get to the middle of the month and certainly the beginning of the next month, it's as if we never taught it. Our job is not to just check off boxes and say, done, 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 done. Our job is to help our students grow. Our job is to help them develop skills as well as learn knowledge that's going to take them to the next level, however that is defined. And so memory and retention are important because they are the vehicles to hold on to the information and allow us to apply it at a later stage. I hope that this is making sense and that I'm making a legitimate argument in your mind for the value of our conversation today. And this really ties into question number four. What are our expectations in terms of student retention and recall, right? Do we really have expectations? Do we really say to ourselves, it'll matter to me, I will assess my lesson based on ultimately, or I'll assess my instruction and my competency ultimately as a teacher on whether or not my students are remembering what I taught short-term and long-term. If we view this as part of our job and we incorporate it into our expectations, then we have the possibility of really developing strategies for long-term retention. And so therefore, going back for a moment to the previous slide to our question, I personally believe that every lesson plan needs to include strategies for retention. What are we doing? What am I doing in this lesson that's going to help my students to remember? And what kind of assignments will I give them beyond today or for homework or something comparable that will ensure that they hold on to it for longer? And I would posit, you know, nobody here answers to me. I want to be very clear. And so you have to, if you are a teacher, for example, you have to clear anything I would say with administration if it's going to affect your work in any meaningful sense. But I would personally prefer, if I was a principal, which I was at one point, my teachers teaching less content or even fewer skills, but teaching them better. When I say better, I mean deeper, with more retention, than teaching more content that will ultimately all be forgotten. Now, I'm not suggesting it's an all or nothing, but I do think that that is part of the divide. We always have the kind of like the fine line we have to walk anytime between breadth and depth, right? If I talk about differentiation, do I kind of like just move through a lot of content? Do I go deeper in the content? And that's a give and take you're always dealing with. It's a fine line, it's a balance. And this year in particular with Corona, where we have less, obviously much less in-person interaction at this point, and in many cases, much fewer touch points, so to speak, with our students, we have to be asking ourselves, how do we apply this? But fundamentally, if we're in agreement that retention matters, then we can start to strategize around how to make it work. Okay, so again, I really do hope that this was enough of a compelling framework around which we can move the rest of our conversation forward. If there are any questions or comments, feel free to include them in the chat. I will be on the lookout for it. And Io and Alice and anyone else who I'm seeing here, Christy, please reply in the future to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see what you have to say. Okay, what I'm going to ask you to do now is to think about an enduring memory. It could be personal, as in something that you know about that others do not, or it could be something that everybody's aware of, something that changed the world, that is a historical moment that everybody can reference and say, oh, yes, I was there when, or I remember when. And that when, for those on the call who may be older, you'd have to be significantly older, I would argue, or more experienced, I should say, to remember this particular experience, which is Kennedy's assassination. I was not alive at that time. What I was alive for is the one on the right, the attacks on World Trade Center during 2001 on 9/11. Okay, so write down, please, a vivid memory for yourself. If you want to share it with the group, you're certainly welcome to do so. But really the question that I want to know is not so much what was the memory, but why you think that you still would remember what occurred. Maybe you remember where you were when you heard about it, what you were wearing, who told you, or how you found out. What was different about a 9/11 piece of information than what you ate for breakfast yesterday? You know, or what a student mentioned to you in conversation last week. Some of you, was very, you know, poignant experiences here, as I see. Okay. So some of you are mentioning what it was, and some of you are mentioning a little bit of why. So Nassia talked about the way you think about reality. That definitely can affect our memory. All right. It was on, the TV was on all day. Thank you, Kim. Catastrophic movie. Yeah. Involved emotion. Okay. So Maria is starting to move us to where we want to go here. All right. Wow. Okay. Being scared. So there's an emotional piece as well. You may be familiar with something called episodic memory. We're going to touch base with it a little bit later. But any memory that creates an episode or is based on an episode, in many cases, will be easier for you to remember than other things that happen. So we're going to talk about what memory is. We'll talk about how to drive retention. All of these things that we're going to be discussing today and in subsequent conversation are useful for you to remember, because the more you can create the totality of a picture that will hit on these various points, the likelihood is that you'll remember. Okay, remembering childbirth, marriage, life cycle events. I'm seeing a lot of that. Okay, all right, a lot based on emotion. That is true. Okay, thank you all for sharing. Keep them coming. I won't be able to reference them all, but if you are sharing them, people will be able to see them. Okay, so I've asked a lot of questions, more so than normal, but here is a working definition for us to be able to utilize moving forward. Take a look at this for a second. Okay, so earlier I asked the question, are memory and retention synonymous? By the way, Josh, you might want to adjust your settings to all panelists and attendees. Regular reminders, I hope you guys don't mind me saying it again and again, but I just want to make sure everybody on the group, can be seeing and learning from each other. Okay, we've got quite a few people on this call, which is exciting. So a definition for our purposes is that memory is a retention of, that means holding on to, and the ability to recall. Both of them are critical and they're different. Okay, let's focus on that for just a second. So retention of means I hold on to it. Recall means I can extract it. And so often you have the information in your brain, but you don't have the ability to extract it when you need it. That's happened to me on webinars. It happened to me yesterday when I was thinking about opportunity costs and I couldn't remember the term, or some other ones until I remembered it a little bit later. And as a result of having effective memory, I'm not only able to hold on to the information, but then I can recall either details or skills or things that I need to do in order to be able to complete a task, right? My 7-year-old asked me to go biking with him the other day. We're all home now, as most of you are. And I actually had not been on a bike in a long time. It just took me a moment, but I had to trigger some skills that had been a little bit dormant for me for even a couple of years. I'm not sure when I last got on a bike. I do exercise a lot, but I don't bike. So that was a bit of a retraining for me. So just kind of thinking about that for a moment is significant. Okay, so now that we have a definition, let's apply this in detail. So here are some core principles to remember. You might want to take some notes over here. Again, because we have a quiz coming up and I would love for everybody to ace it. Extra ice cream for everybody who does. Okay. Information is stored in multiple areas of the brain and is retrieved through various pathways. Okay. I hope that makes sense to you. That means that we've got different components of our brain. This is not going to be a very detailed brain conversation, but we just need enough to understand what memory is all about. And our brain is not a single entity. We think of it as one entity. It's got a number of parts. I'm not going to get into all the biological subcomponents, if you will, but we need to understand that our brain is made up of different components, and therefore we utilize different pathways to have information enter as well as get extracted. I'll give you an example. So I live in New Jersey and I canvass the greater New York, New Jersey area, not now, but generally in a lot of the coaching work that I do. And so I will often, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I will often get off of the highway at a particular exit, and I will, as a result, remember to follow up with somebody. Has that ever happened to you? Did you ever put music in your, used to be a CD player, something once upon a time, or did you ever do that with your Apple player, whatever it is, and the music triggers a memory or reminds you to do something? So it could be location based. It could be based on, like I said, a phrase that you hear, music that's playing, some other reminder. It could be weather related. So we don't know what's going to extract the information. I'll tell you this now because I think it's really cool and I'll probably have opportunity to go deeper with it later. When I was a teacher, I lived in Chicago at the time. So those of you familiar with the state of Illinois, Chicago is in the northeastern part of the state. And in the central, maybe southern part of Illinois is a city called Peoria, which is about halfway between Chicago and St. Louis. Now, this woman a woman from Peoria had come to Chicago because she was an expert on memory, and she was giving a number of different classes on the topic, and that was something that was of interest to me. Now, you oftentimes see these commercials where they say, don't try this at home. So I'm not encouraging you to do this, but let me just tell you to what extreme this woman took her own thinking and practice in order to help her students remember better. She would wear the same outfit for the entire unit. That means she never changed her outer clothing, or maybe she had multiple outfits. Let's assume that that was the case. She had multiple outfits all looking the same, but looked the same every day for the entire unit. Would anyone like to suggest why somebody would do that, other than the fact that they just like the outfit a lot? Okay, Carol talked about association. Good. What else? Visual tie-in. Yes, that's great. She was trying to make herself a visual cue, right? Have you ever had this experience? I'm going to try to replicate it the best I can. A student is at their desk and they're taking a test. I'm looking down on purpose, by the way, nothing personal. Taking their test at their desk, and they look up at you and they kind of stare at you. They don't say anything to you, or maybe they look behind you and then they look back down and they continue taking their test. Has that ever happened to you? And if the answer is yes, why do you think that that they're doing that? Why would a student look up at you when you, let's even say that you've made very clear no questions. Why would it be valuable for your students to look at you and look back down? Okay, trying to picture what was there, trying to trigger a memory, recalls, excellent. So you guys are really on target here. They are using you as a retrieval cue, which is why you should always test students in the same environment where the test was given, where the content was taught. For example, that's why you should never have a substitute give a test for you. So I used to think, the brilliant me back in the day, that it was better for me to, if I had to be away for a day, better to be away on a test day, because I'm not really teaching anyway. And I learned that that was really a mistake, because students, number one, there were questions that maybe weren't so clear, and the substitute, the proctor couldn't help. And number two, I wasn't available to be the trigger for them, the recall. So that's why it's so important for us to be thinking about memory and retention, because ultimately we create certain rules for student success. And to whatever degree in particular, testing is a foundation to that, right or wrong. I'm not going to pontificate on that. I'll get off, I won't even get on that soapbox today. But to the degree that testing is the method of choice, let's at least give them every opportunity to succeed. I do a separate presentation. You could reply yes or no if this is of interest to you. If you even want me to talk about strategies on test taking, right? How do we create tests that would be effective, as well as how do we train our students to be more efficient and effective test takers? And in that presentation, one thing I talk about is a mind dump. Please forgive the language, but it's the idea that anything I bring into the test on my own, as in here, is fair game. I can use it on the test. Anything that I bring here on my piece of paper, that's cheating. So if I have it in here, but I'm afraid I'm going to forget it, and I may want to be able to utilize it later on the test, what should I do? What do you think? If I'm a teacher, if I'm a student, and I want this information, I've had a really hard time remembering this algebraic formula, a really hard time remembering all of the different components of this type of element on the periodic table, whatever it is, I don't remember it well, and I'm forgetting all the time. What should I do? Angela, you are right. That's the mind dump. You put it on the paper as soon as you get the test, because once it's from your head, if the moment like 3 o'clock hits and that's when the test is, you jot it down on your test. CJ, you're right. That's exactly the point. CJ, by the way, adjust your chat, please. Angela, the same, so everybody can see what you're sharing with me. But the idea here is that it's fair game and it's permitted. Okay, so that's not cheating at that point. So the idea here is that the more that we can give students ways by which, coming back to the slide now, because I've gotten a little bit off the topic, all within the same direction, is that the more that we give students access to information, a great pathway in, and then ways by which to retrieve it, we are doing the students a tremendous service. And by the way, I know I talked about this in a previous webinar, but how many of you did I share with the idea of wait time? Madeline Hunter's science-based strategy that you should wait 7 seconds between the end of asking a question and when the answer is, when students are allowed to respond. So in other words, I ask a question, and instead of immediately allowing anyone who shoots up their hand to say, me, and you call on them, you give the class 7 seconds to respond. Can anyone not only tell me if you remember, thank you, Blessing, for that, but why that would be the case? What is the benefit? I know 7 seconds is like an eternity in a classroom, especially for those of us who are concerned about classroom management. We're afraid that if we leave the air, kind of like have this vacuum of noise, that all of a sudden somebody's going to fill it with something distracting. You know, spitballs will go flying or something like that. So why would I risk that to give my students 7 seconds? Okay, so we want to let the students think about it, right? Formulate the proper answer. These are great responses. What else? It does help the students process the question, but there's another piece to it. And that's what Nasia has over here, and the idea of recalling. Some students have faster pathways to recall than others. It may be, like you talked about, Kelly, the retrieval piece. It may just be deeper. Angela, please adjust your chat settings. It might be deeper in your memory, however that looks. I visualize it like literally deep. But whatever that looks like to you, it may take longer for that to come forth. Now, if I'm a student, I'm not weaker than another student. I'm just slower in the retrieval piece of it. If I know that every time a teacher asks a question and Johnny shoots up his hand before even hearing the question half the time, and the teacher calls on Johnny every single time that happens or someone similar, then where does it leave me as the student who will answer the question with the proper amount of time, but never is given that amount of time? The answer, I think we all know, is that I will stop raising my hand, or I won't even try, because I will feel that there's no chance that I'm going to be called on. So giving students those extra few seconds is usually the difference between a small percentage of response and a very high percentage of response. And you can create increased accountability. Many of you talked earlier about checking for understanding, right? It's hard to check for understanding if I'm not giving students enough time to demonstrate their understanding. Now, I recognize you don't only use questioning for that. You're probably using graphic organizers and 1-minute papers and all sorts of different things that we have talked about. But if you are giving your students the benefit of a little more time, you are helping them tremendously. Okay, in the interest of time, by the way, let's move to the next slide over here. I actually would like to show you a short video shortly as well that I think will reinforce this message, but we'll get there soon. Okay, so there are a couple of different kinds of memory. Besides for long-term and short-term and all of that, there's actually the way in which we kind of embed information or don't. You've got spatial and you have rote. Now, by the way, this is what the quiz will be on, all this memory stuff. So I hope you're taking some kind of notes, at least in your mind, and that you are ready. Because again, I don't want anybody to lose their ice cream. So, sorry, let's go back for a moment. So spatial is where information is engaged in a more what's the proper term? In a more complete sense. Multiple systems of our brain, or maybe even our body, because we know, I think we've talked about this before, that we take in information through all of our senses, right? So I hear information and I see it. Those are the two most common, but I could smell, I could touch, and I could also taste information, right? So we can be engaging our students in different ways, and whether our students are different kinds of learners, think intelligences and modalities, or whether they just are utilizing different senses, the more we embed it within a normal, natural form of memory, the better the information will be processed, understood, and recalled. Unfortunately, so often what we wind up doing is the rote piece, which is we'll give students lists, like for example, vocabulary words. And we will, just give them 40 or 40 some odd presidents of the United States, for example. Remember this, all the capitals of the, the different states, or anything that is information just on its own that is typically less effective. So if we can embed it in our senses, that's why, for example, teaching the states with song is a much better way to do it than teaching it as a list, because you're going deeper with the information, you're connecting it to other senses, other forms of memory, other forms of modality, and the result of that is typically better recall. So I used to teach history to high school sophomores, and let's just say the information was engaging. I'd like to think that it was, but who remembers historical information much later on? I would have them come back to my classroom as seniors, because there's this thing that happens sometimes with high school seniors that they get into this, I can roam the hall stance. And they'd roam the hall, and my door was always open. And if we were singing, they would definitely be coming in, and many of them remembered the song. So I would teach them certain names based on songs that they were familiar with. And even 2 years later, they'd be able to engage and remember a lot of the specific information because I embedded it in a song. And I can promise you, if I had done it just as a list of names, there's no way in the world that they would have engaged, let alone remembered all that information at a later point. So spatial is definitely the choice over here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to share my computer sound. Please confirm that you could hear this once we start playing. A brief video on memory and encoding. And when you're done, please share with me what was one thing that you learned from this video. So grab your popcorn, and here we go.
We're going to talk about memory. And I'm not going to sing. Memories. Okay. Now, years ago, and there's some people that still believe this, but years ago, it was believed.
Sorry about that, just 1 second.
That when information came into the brain, it hit the conscious mind first, and then some of it got filtered down into the subconscious for the permanent memory, the long-term memory. However, what they know now, and that was called the early selection theory, the late selection theory, is that all input hits your subconscious first. And when you think about it, that does make sense, because the primary job of the subconscious is to protect. That means survival. So when the information comes in, the very first thing that happens, does this have something to do with survival? And if it does, it gets a priority, and it gets handled, the fight or flight. Now, what's left over with all the other information? Well, is there a lot? Yeah. Every second, there are 2 billion bits of information that hit your subconscious mind. Every second, 2 billion bits of information. Now, you may be saying to yourself, what the heck's he talking about, 2 billion? Well, guess what? Your subconscious is sensing everything, because information comes in through the senses. Right now, your skin is checking on the atmospheric pressure, the temperature, the humidity, how about the ambient noise? All these things are being checked, not just once, but every single second. And that information goes in. Now, this is information that the brain already has. So what does it do? It says, I got that already. So it garbages it. Most of that information that hits you is already there. So it garbages it. Now, if it has to do with survival, it handles it first. For the rest of the information, it throws away most of it. Now, what's left over? What's left over, it has to sort through. It has to filter, because you have certain perceptive filters. So it says, do I already have some information about this? Do I have file folders? Do I have a place to put this information? Now, if it does have the file folders, great, it gets handled. And it knows where to put it, and it adds it to the data bank, right? If it doesn't, it has to create new files. And that takes a little bit of time. And you might have to repeat the information, or repeat the information, or, right, before the file folders get properly set up. Now, what I'm doing for you tonight is I'm setting up file folders in your brain right now. All of these are file folders, so that when you get around to reading the book, if you haven't already read it, when you read it, go, bang. It's not that consciously you're going to say, oh, I heard that before. Your subconscious is ready for the input. It's ready to take it in. It's got a place to put this stuff. Same thing when you do a concept map, an idea map, before you read the book. You go through and get your table of contents, create one of those. So when you do read the book, there are file folders. There are places to put it. Memory is rather interesting. You've probably all heard of false memory syndrome. You've probably already heard that when you remember something, it's not quite accurate. You hear that witnesses saw an accident and you get all these different versions. Police certainly know that. Because when the information comes in, that information gets deconstructed. It's sent all over the brain. There's some visual images, there's some auditory images, there's some kinesthetic images. They're put all over the place. You've got smell, you've got taste, all these different things. So, when you remember something, it must be reconstructed. And chances are the reconstruction might be a little skewed, a little garbled. That does happen, doesn't it? It's not that you're lying, it's that this is the best of your recollection, which is a wonderful line. The best of my recollection, right? And that's why when you take in the information, it's better to take it in with as many senses as possible. So if you can bring emotion into it, boy, that helps. Think about the farthest back in your life when you were a child. What's the earliest memory you have? Chances are it has something to do with emotion. Emotion has a lot to do with encoding memory.
Okay, thank you for watching, and you can keep your popcorn out if you have some. Any feedback here? What did you learn from this, either as a reinforcement of what we talked about before or something new? Emotional memories are retained. Subconscious comes in first or enters through the subconscious. While you're responding, by the way, please also share how this might affect your professional practice. What could you be utilizing from what I've shared, from what Dr. Wall shared, that you could be using or should be thinking about as you are planning moving forward? Best to involve our senses, yes. File folders, good. Thank you, Kelly. I was looking for that also. Yeah, multisensory. Yeah, but by the way, the brain, the comparison between the brain and a computer is fascinating, but it's actually very relevant. In fact, I would argue that computers were based off of our awareness of the brain. And the more we give our students places to organize things, by the way, that's true for graphic organizers as well. That's why they're so powerful. But giving them places to put information is very important. And if you can teach from macro to micro, it's called the funnel approach. You begin with the big idea. You talk about the different areas we're going to focus on, and then you start to fill in all of the gaps. In effect, what you're doing is you're putting it into folders. So understanding the progression of information, the way we think, the way we build ideas, remembering, by the way, the same thing that you will say or the same event that will occur, different students will remember it differently. That's also true. This has been really great feedback, and I appreciate it. So I think we're kind of working towards something over here. I think we understand that maybe our understanding of memory wasn't quite what actually is going on, but minimally what I'm looking for is how do we create the framework moving forward to maximize student clarity on the front end? Because remember, you want to get it clear from the beginning. Otherwise, you're going to forget it moving forward. And by the way, when they learn it wrong or incorrectly, you're going to have to unteach and reteach. And I'm going to give you an example of that, probably not in this webinar, but in a subsequent one, of something that happened to me when I was about 9 years old that made me feel, in retrospect, like a real idiot because I learned it wrong, but I still remember how I remembered it originally and ultimately how I learned differently moving forward. Okay, so how does information make its way through the brain? How does it flow? So there are different pathways over here. Let's talk about a few of them. One of them is through our senses. So we talked about this before. All of these matter. Now, I'm just curious, would anyone like to share examples of what you do? Forget sight and hearing, because that we all do. What do you do in smelling, tasting, or touch with your students that allows them to engage with ideas or materials with those senses, and as a result to help them remember it longer? Okay, hand motions, good. What else do we do? Let's get a lot of that. So that's kinesthetic as well. There's a lot, there's oftentimes rhythmic and musical, depending on what you're doing. So that's important one. Anchor charts. All right. All these ideas, please share them. Liz, by the way, adjust your chat. Wilfred, adjust your chat, please. I want everybody to be able to see what you're writing. So please respond, everybody, to all panelists and attendees. Okay. Music, hand motions. Everybody, please keep reading. I'm not going to get all of them, but the very fact that we're using these different things are helpful. And think about more that you could be doing, even if it doesn't feel like a direct association. Even if it's just like, I'm going to distribute a fragrance or create a certain fragrance in the classroom, or have certain music playing, or maybe have certain hand motions going. All these things are, what's the word I'm looking for? They're all ways to deepen learning. So remember that senses do matter. And they matter with our communication too, but that's a different conversation. Okay, once the information is in our system, it starts in our short-term memory. That's what catches our attention. But remember that our short-term memory cannot hold very much. That's why, for example, I don't know if you had this growing up, but when I was very young, first of all, New York City, once upon a time, believe it or not, there was only one area code for the entire city. There were no cell phones. It was just 212 for everywhere. And then they added 718 for some of the boroughs, and it's, you know, kind of morphed into many more since that time. But I remember my grandparents on their phone, they used to have 2 letters followed by 5 digits. And the 2 letters represented 2 numbers, but they were 2 letters of the alphabet. I don't know if that ever was part of your, you know, your youth, your experience. And I think one of the reasons that they did that is because they wanted to cluster information to make it like a chunk. Like, for example, if I could remember an area code, I mentioned 212. So let's talk about that. If 212 is one idea, it's no longer 3 numbers, it's 1. And if the middle 3 digits are somehow numbers I put together, then they become 1. Sometimes you'll associate numbers with a jersey of a football player that you're a fan of, or a date that's personally memorable for you. People who have great memories, oftentimes it's not that they're remembering tons of disparate information, but they're creating linkages that bring a lot of pieces of information together into something much smaller and easier to remember. So we have brief retention and small amounts. That's why we don't want to be hanging out in the short-term memory for very long. We got to move it to somewhere more permanent. Okay. So some of it will continue on to the long-term memory. Even earlier in the video, you heard about subconscious, what's processed, what's not processed. So not everything that goes into your mind is going to be held on to. A lot of it is going to be lost. But what we want to do as teachers, because we value everything that we're teaching, is to move material into long-term storage, right? This is the kind of thing that can last a lifetime. And we know this because there are things that happened when we were very young and we still remember them. So we want to move from short-term to long-term. That's the goal. Now, what is it about our memory that allows all of this to happen? It's something called working memory. So working memory, think of it as a computer. Our computer also has working memory. The more memory our computer has, the more capable it is of multitasking, of doing a variety of things, of keeping information moving and flowing in the right direction, whichever way that is, you know, all happening at the same time. Okay? So, yeah, Janet, that is funny. Thank you, Danielle, for the comment there. Okay, so right, memory is something we all deal with. And obviously, as we age, we have to be more mindful of it than ever. But think about it from the perspective of our students. Again, the more we know about what they're going to remember and how to get it into a more deeply stored place, as well as recalling it more readily, we're just giving them skills that help them be better students and better people in the future. All right? So here is that image that draws a parallel between the human brain, which is the red text on the left side, and the computer on the right side. Okay, Nasia, thank you for letting me know. And yes, it will all be recorded and shared. All right, so you see over here that we've got everything from the input at the base, which is the widest component because it's inputting, and a computer will input through keyboard, mouse, etc., or from external files. We will input through our memory, through the environment, and then we have different places where it's either stored or utilized in some kind of way. So there's a lot of parallel between the two, and the more we think about memory through that vein, it'll help us remember material for ourselves. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about long-term memory in particular. And again, I apologize that this is more information than strategies, but I think it's really laying the foundation for what we're going to be doing, if not today, then the next time, specific to strategies. Okay, so there are two kinds of long-term memory. There's declarative and procedural. Declarative is more the facts, the who, what, where, when, how, the 5 W's. And even within declarative, there are two kinds. There's semantic and episodic. So semantic is more information, what something means, being able to explain something, things that are independent of time and space. It's what we call information, data, facts. That's semantic. There are other facts that are episodic. That means that they're embedded in environment. They're embedded in experience or events. So I might have this, I can know about Osama bin Laden and the Taliban and 9/11 in a semantic fashion, which is true, by the way, pretty much for anybody who was born later on. Your students that you might have right now never experienced 9/11 personally. So for them, it may be more semantic. But for anyone who experienced it firsthand, it's episodic, right? I know exactly where I was when I was told about it. I was living in Chicago at the time. I know exactly who told me. I know exactly the language he used, and I can't repeat all of it here, but I remember it. And I remember going down to the gym with NPR playing and everybody listening and everybody scared and not knowing what to do. And literally listening to somebody in the World Trade Center describing what's going on with somebody on NPR, not realizing that he was about to lose his life unless he got out somehow, because the buildings would shortly afterwards collapse and nobody really knew what was happening. We're still trying to make sense of it all. So these are, that's all declarative memory. That's information. Separate from that is procedural information memory, which is how to do things. Riding a bike, for example, is procedural. Turning on a computer, using Zoom, right? Engaging your students, especially remotely. These are all, typically speaking, things that go into your procedural. It may start as declarative. It may start as conscious incompetence. We talked about this, I think, once upon a time. The idea that when we first start, we know what we need to know, or at least we're thinking about it, and we're really incompetent. We don't know what we're doing. And eventually we want to get to a level of unconscious competence where we're not even thinking about it. And we know how to do it, like getting on a bike and riding or driving your car, because you know how to do it and you know how to do it well since you do it all the time. You don't think about driving a car when you're driving it. You think about the weather, who you need to call, what you want to play on your, on your radio or on your speaker, who you're talking to, because you're so far past that you don't need that anymore. So these are different pieces of it. So to briefly review before we move on, we talked about short-term memory and we talked about long-term memory. Within long-term memory, we talked about declarative, which is semantic and episodic. So it's information, whether it's information alone, like isolated details, semantic, or episodic, which means it's embedded in experience or episodes. And then there's also procedural memory, which is how to do things. By the way, I'm prepping you for a quiz, which is coming soon. And then we also talked about with the memory, let's go back for just a moment. So we get everything here. Let's see, hold on one second. Okay, we talked about short-term memory, right? And getting the information through our senses. These are all pieces that we discussed. All right, so let's take a look and see how this looks. 3 different visuals all in front of you at the same time. Let's begin on the left side. Okay, so episodic. Remember, the top 2 are episodic and semantic are both parts of what? Let's go back to the previous slide for just a second. Sorry, go the other way. Semantic and episodic, did I skip? Are both part of declarative, all right? And then procedural is how to do something. Now, this computer has not been used in a really long time, but you get the idea. It's a little bit of a dated graphic, and I hope you don't mind that. Actually, all of these are a bit dated, which is a memo to self. I need to update these a little bit. But you see over here a visual on the left side of what are examples Episodic might be something I did, like an event I attended or something I practiced myself. Semantic is just information you typically would find in a library. And procedural is something I need to do and learn how to do it. Okay. Now on the other side of it, we've got memory broken into short-term and long-term. Long-term divided further into declarative and procedural, and declarative divided further into semantic and episodic. Now, some of you are really great with text. Some of you are good with pictures. Some of you are good when you see things in a relationship and how they relate. So this is actually helping different kinds of learners remember information by seeing the breakdown. And your brain will take a picture of it and we'll see how it all kind of comes together. So that's why utilizing different kinds of tools to ensure long-term memory is helpful. In other words, we're trying to remember about memory. In fact, that's what we're doing, right? If I want to quiz you, which I'm going to do, on different forms of memory, I want to give you every opportunity to succeed. So I want to show you, I want to describe it, I want to give you an opportunity to practice it. All of these things, and I'm limited a little bit in what I can do in this particular environment and how much time we have together to teach this to you. But the more that I can deepen and embed it, the more you're going to remember it. I hope that this makes sense and hope that you could see the value of trying to go deeper here on a lot of it. Here's one more example, all within the long term. Keep in mind that declarative and this one kind of reverses it. Instead of calling it semantic, it calls it declarative, but really it's semantic and declarative is the bigger one. I hope that that makes sense. So earlier we talked about declarative followed by semantic and procedural. I'm sorry, semantic and episodic, actually. So it's a little bit different here, the way that this describes it, but it does hit on all the pieces. So we've got semantic as in information. I know even numbers. Procedural is I know how to do something, such as analyze a sentence, ride a bike, whatever, fix a car. And episodic is I remember something based on an experience, a conversation that I had, something that was happening around me, okay? Now, finally, I didn't really show it to you, but I showed you that that is the quiz. So please take out a pen. I'm going to ask you to take a look at the questions. You'll jot them down. We're going to go through them one by one, sort of. Let's see how we do this, because the chat is always a little bit tricky since it's a time delay, but let's give it our best. And I apologize, by the way, we're probably going to wind up going over just a couple of minutes, but I hope you could bear with me to the very end. All right, so here are the examples on the left side. Please number them 1 through 7, and then tell me what kind of memory. We're talking specifically about long-term memory, so don't worry about short-term memory. Is it procedural? Is it episodic? Is it declarative? Is it semantic? What specifically? And go ahead and kind of like just keep all the answers to yourself for now, and we'll get them soon. So Angela, I thank you for getting us started, but let's hold that for a moment so everybody can kind of go through all of them together, and then we will self-assess. No worries, Angela, all good. Okay, thank you, Kelly. I will quickly link in my YouTube channel here, but it is in the email address that I sent to you guys as well. So you should have it. And please do subscribe because there's lots of goodies there, including the ability to access these webinars. Okay, so you may need a little bit more time, and that's okay. But in the interest of our time together, let's see if we can go through these, and we'll do them one by one. So riding a bike. What kind of memory is required for riding a bike? I think we can scroll back up to Angela's answer. And that correct. Thank you, Kim, as well. Procedural, right? It's something we do. Excellent. For those of you still responding, appreciate it. Okay, listing the presidents. Now, remember, we're talking long-term information. So long-term memory, not short-term. So this one is, to remember the presidents is, well, it's a form of declarative and specifically semantic, right? Okay, excellent. Remembering a childhood incident. I know these answers are sort of going to blur over here. So at this point, please write your answer with the number first. So just in case it takes you a little bit longer for me to see your responses, please put it in there. Number 3 is Episodic, that's correct. Excellent. How about dialing an unwritten phone number? Number 4, please again write the number and then your response or vice versa. Number 4, the unwritten phone number is semantic, right? We'd also call that perhaps rote. It's not really necessarily embedded in an experience. Okay, going back to what we talked about before. Great. Okay, recollection from a class trip. That would be episodic as well, yes. Unless there's a procedure involved, but typically speaking, that is episodic. Recalling Pythagoras's theorem, number 6. All right, that is semantic, great. And finally, number 7, if I want to plan an event that did not happen yet for clarification, that would be procedural. All right, you guys are good. Okay, so let us now wrap up our, oh, we have it over here. Oh, you know what? I cheated. Number 3 is wrong because I wrote assuming long-term memory and then I wrote short-term. So I failed. Okay, you can check your answers over here. All right, riding a bike is procedural, as is, you know what? Hold on. There are, well, I guess it depends on recalling how you define the Pythagoras theorem piece. There are a couple of different components here, but you start to see at least where this kind of fits in. So, you know what? I wonder if these are right. I'm going to skip this because I think I made some mistakes here. Scratch that. I think your answers in the text were better. So let's go on and then let's wrap up here. And I think the next time we're going to go further. So I see that we're late and I don't want to hold you much longer. All right. So when it comes to the activities, we want to be thinking about storing it, retrieving it, and then the deletion component. Deleting is not really what you're focused on. That happens on its own. Anything that happens passively will be deleted. What we want to focus on is the storing, which we've already talked about. How do we encode it more deeply? And then how do we get students to retrieve it? Now, typically speaking, when we test our students, whether on the day of a test or beforehand, we're either asking them to recognize or we're asking them to recall. Recognition is easier because you're just selecting from something already existing. So for example, multiple choice is recognition. True and false is recognition, so is matching. But once I have to do short answers, certainly if I have to write an essay or explain something in detail, usually that's going to be based on recall. So when we ask our students to recall information, we're asking them to do something that is harder than simply to recognize it. Just be mindful of that, okay? And then over here, before we wrap up, let's go to this, sorry. Right, so why do we forget? And this is the part I think we're going to emphasize most before we wrap up today. We forget because either we didn't encode it properly from the beginning. Again, that was our underlying theme over here. Teach towards recall. Make sure that they're remembering it. That's the goal. So help them encode it as best as possible, whether that's through rhyme or song or movement or review. Sometimes they don't recall it because we're not using a proper retrieval cue. You may have had this experience where you ask them a question, they don't get it. You re-ask it in a different way, or you let a peer or colleague use their language to explain it and ask it, and then all of a sudden they remember because the retrieval cue was off. So how we extract it is important, okay? Sometimes we forget because other experiences happen. So there's today's lunch, what happened at lunch today is replacing what happened yesterday, which replaces what happened the day before. That's why it may be easier for me to remember 9/11 than me to remember what I had for breakfast a week or so ago, because so many other experiences have come since then that have blurred that previous experience. Sometimes it's based on time, and sometimes it is based on a drive to keep us sane. So these are all different reasons as to why we will forget. Let's remember that ultimately we need to find ways to create backups in our brain, literal and figurative, for the purpose of recall. So bottom line is, we're going to wrap up over here. I want to thank you all for being here and for participating in this webinar. A couple of links I'm going to share with you real quick before we wrap up, and I hope that this was valuable. One other question I'm going to ask you in a minute is, what was the key learning piece for you today? So bear with me for another moment. In the chat, I just included, did I? Yeah, I sent it. No, I didn't send it yet. Okay, in the chat, I just included a bunch of links. I am in the process of putting together Mastermind, so anybody who would like to consider participating, either for teachers or school leaders, go ahead and complete that form. Anyone who's interested in new webinars, including offerings next week, Wednesday and Thursday, Very exciting ones. The Thursday one will be a follow-up to this webinar. Please grab that link at upcoming webinars on my website. And anyone who wants to contribute and find ways to support the work that I'm doing, I shared a few links with you as well. Please do stay in touch. And of course, if you want to grab a copy of Becoming the New Boss, which is my leadership book, I would love to learn about that. And of course, one day, hopefully inscribe it for you in person. So please do share in the chat before we go what your big takeaway was. What is the one thing that you're going to be doing moving forward, either as an action or at least something that you're going to think about that will hopefully enhance your professional practice and increase retention of learning in your classroom or in life in general. You're welcome, Liz. I appreciate you being here. Thank you all for being here. Looking for your takeaway, learning, and strategy. Okay, here they come. Retention strategies, intentional connections, sensory strategies. Good stuff, everybody. The main thing is use it or lose it. So with this, I'm going to wrap up our session today. I'm going to stop the recording now. And just for our